of India, but most of the population, as what it's trying to do is to uphold the unconscious imaginary of the Hindi speaker. Well, let's put it like that. So there is words like Hindi narrative structure, Hindi unconscious imaginary. I've refrained using the word Indian because I'm looking at narratives through language. Okay. Another thing I just want to point out that psychoanalysis draws heavily from literature. Like if you look at psychoanalysis and its concept, whether it's Oedipus, whether he turned to Shakespeare in order to conceptualize something like repetition to compulsion. So he found a lot of psychic process within literature which he corroborated in his clinical practice, like denial of reality, splitting of ego. So there was a kind of, and all the psychoanalysts turned to literature, whether it's Lacan, whether it's feminism. So yeah, I've already talked about this. One thing I would just like to leave it to thought is the death of the author. I mean, am I analyzing the author? No, I'm not analyzing the author. This is the idea which has been given by Roland Barthes, where he says that the text is a tissue of rotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture. So it's the culture's mimetic representation through the text, but not only that. Text entails a structure that is cyclic. And this statement eliminates the author from the definition of the text. Instead, for Barthes, the text is purely textual. The author is nowhere to be seen. In fact, he's radically absent in the to put it very superficially, the author might die, but the text will stay. It will speak for its time. We're not going to analyze the author all the time to understand the text. It has some relevance because of the language and its structure. And I have also written a lot about why literature, borrowing ideas from Premchand and Sartre and also Roland Barthes, that writing is an act of disclosure. It has a radical potential to effect a change because it commands a change through some expression. So literature represents more as a question, never finally as an answer. Okay? So now at this juncture, let me turn to analysis. That was too much of theory and concepts, but I could not help because I had to situate my work through that. So I just want to clarify this part. So I chose two novels after reviewing almost 15 to 16 novels. I met a lot of literary experts in my own university, and these novels have been selected based on what another literary criticist, Shoshana Feldman, talks about textual problematization. So this is Uska Bachpan by Krishna Baldev Zad, Lal Ki Chal by Nirmal Verma, and Aapka Banti by Manu Bhandar. Okay, and these are, as you can see, all post-colonial literature. So there's a reason why I did not take texts which were before 1947, because 1947 really marks a very important shift in the sensibility of the population, of the society, but also there's a change in the literary tradition. Like, before the writers were writing, it was as a critique of the British imperialism. And the child was either used as a sense of, as an object of vulnerability, as an object of resistance, as an object of oppression. Like you talk about Premchand, that what the British Empire kind of, the kind of psychic sensibilities. Rudyard Kipling also went on to say that Indians are half savage and half children. So, the children needs to be socialized. And, John Milton, he said that British imperialism, in fact, is a whole task of civilizing a society which is very childish to control them. So this is the way they legitimized their oppression, the colonial oppression. But I have chosen the text which is after 1947, just to brief it up in one line. That is because in the literary expressions, the sensibility, now the child acquires a larger consciousness. There's a heavy agency where the child is represented as a speaking subject with all complexity, all vulnerability, whereas initially, earlier, the child was just as an object on the margins of the literature, just as an object, right? Through poverty, through repression, oppression. So here we have a child which is more political, it acquires a very social and political agency to speak and to express. Okay. All right, so now coming on to the underlying imaginaries through fantasies. So what the main thread of imagination remains tied to the mother, okay? And what we see is either a very negative, destructive fantasy or a longing and nostalgia for the mother. So these are from different novels, and you might feel a bit jumbled up because I've just taken some narratives. As you know, it's such a heavy, like, put together, I mean, too much of things to say. So I will be reading out the narratives, and there's an English translation also for people who cannot read Hindi. So the first one is, I think I will just grab it to sit here. Yeah. Is the destructive persecutory fantasy. माँ के साथ सहानुभूति का अनुभव नहीं होता, उसकी इच्छा होती है कि आगे बढ़कर उसकी पीठ पर एक ऐसी लात जमा दे कि उसका सिर चूल्हे में घुस जाए, उसके होश ठिकाने आ जाए. So this is the imagination of the child which I am capturing, and the mother also appears as an object of fear. माँ बोलता क्यों नहीं, तुझसे बहुत डर लगता है माँ. वह स्वप्न भरी आंखें खोलता तो देखता है माँ को, और उसके मुख पर सुर्ख मुस्कुराहट की बजाय भय की स्याही बिखर जाती है. What we see is an overbearing, engulfing mother. So this is a sense of a preeminent fear of engulfment. So the presence of an omnipotent mother evokes fear and loathing. So what is recognized, like I said, the first imagination is tied primarily to the object of mother. And exclusive female mothering leads to inevitable fear of women. I mean, why? Because the mother is constantly present in the psyche. Structurally, she cannot move around. She's situated within a very domestic realm, a fear which leads children to betray the engulfing mother by turning to the father in search of emotional security. So when we look at the mother-daughter fantasies, what we see is the fantasy of hateful conflict and rivalry with the colors of contempt and hatred from the mother's side and avoidance and retaliation from the daughter's side. Unconscious expressions of mother's repressed wish to control the daughter. जहां भी हो जाकर चोटी से पकड़कर घसीट ला, अपने आप तो वो सारी रात घर नहीं आएंगी. अच्छा तेरी ये हिम्मत, अब तो मुझे आंखें दिखाने लग गई है. ऊंट जितना तेरा कद हो गया है, तुझे कुछ शर्म हया है कि नहीं. घर में बैठते तुझे मौत आती है. So there's something that I missed actually. So I just want to kind of situate the problematic. So uska bachpan is situated within a context of extreme poverty, extreme deprivation. So it tries to understand the imaginary of childhood where there is a pervasive sense of deprivation. And the relationship between the mother and the child, the husband and the wife is extremely abusive. Lal Teen Ki Chhat I selected because it's the only novel in the Hindi literature which kind of taps the consciousness of a girl child. And Aapka Bandi is something which is a modern creation where it talks about different structures of parenting. So it's about single parenting and completely understanding the dynamics of the mother with the child, and also with the phenomena of divorce, which is a very modern phenomena, so to speak, and understand.
Is it possible for you to give a little translation of these titles for those who don't understand Hindi?
Okay, yeah, sure. So uska bachpan means their childhood or his childhood, so to speak. Lal Teen Ki Chhat, so Lal Teen is like a red teen's roof. So it's symbolic of the place where they stay. And Aapka Bandi is like yours Bandi, so there's a whole revelation about the child Bandi. I also, if you want, I can give like a short description of the novel in 2 or 3 lines. Would that be sufficient? I think that will kind of situate it better, the narratives that I present. Okay. All right. So the first novel, the story is centered around a child named Biru. Immersed in extreme and deplorable state of absolute poverty, Viru lives out his life in dire conditions of hunger and deprivation. So the purpose was that this is quite a reality in our society, where a lot of childhood is deprived. The family comprises of Viru, his mother, his granddaughter, elder sister Devi, and an alcoholic and abusive father who stays mostly outside home and is into gambling. The relationship between parents is largely conflicting and violent. The father physically abuses the mother every day. Although there are many intricacies involving every character and their relation, my description and analysis concerns with the identification and analysis of the affective fantasies. So affective fantasies are primarily through the domain of lens of emotions. Lal Teen Ki Chhat by Nirmal Verma was chosen for two reasons. Firstly, the consciousness of a girl child, Kaya, has been employed in this novel, which expresses the inner world of girl child. And secondly, it is very rare to find the use of child's character to understand life with deep insight. Assume child to be a very philosophical, which cannot have sort of revelations and insight about their reality and understanding. For me, these two reasons were good enough to pique and evoke my interest. Kaya, a young girl, lives with her mother who is pregnant and bedridden, and younger brother Chote in her house with a red tin roof. Her father does not live with them as he works in the city. He visits them very occasionally. The story mainly flows through the deep thoughts of Kaya, who feels a deep nostalgia for her distant father and experiences immense psychic pain for her bedridden mother. She, along with Chote, wanders outside all day long. Immersed in deep thoughts, the novels evoke a dark imagery of loneliness as the plot is situated in the northern hills. One can also feel a strong sense of melancholia and loneliness that permeates through the entire story as a constant theme. The third novel is Aapka Banti by Manu Bhandari. Although the aspect of analysis of the author has been consciously eliminated, but in the selection of a novel, a need was felt to understand the imaginary from a female perspective, hence a female author. The novel was specially preferred because the central theme pivots around the intimate relation between the couples and its psychic implication on the child, reflecting upon how the subjectivities of two adults with their own complexities and conflicts can impact the inner world of the child. This novel also depicts the changing structures and patterns of parenting. The concept in either single parenting creates a sense of possibility in changing the conventional parenting arrangement in the society. The story is placed in the context of marital divorce. There have been many alterations within the institution of family over time, and hence single parenting and remarriage has emerged as a variant option which challenges the tradition of heteronormativity underlying the institution of marriage. The novel has opened up the likelihood of varied imaginations. So within these frames, I hope you were able to kind of grasp something about the novels and the context, which has been elaborated more. So within the context of these three novels, I have tried to explore the unconscious imaginary between the mother and the child and the father and the child and the entire complexity that exists, right? So I think maybe we can take it's already time. So can we take like 2 minutes break and then I will talk about my findings. I'll just jump to some of the major findings. Okay, I'll just have it. Yeah, I think I'll give it because there's a positive time and I really want to share my findings and the discourses. So this is the mother's fantasy to kind of restrict the movement of the child, to kind of control the daughter. And her freedom of movement, socializing around the neighborhood, is a marker of a developing individuality. in this particular case, the unconscious affect of mother's threat from an individuated daughter, when the daughter will separate. And then further fantasy, which is all about आपका बंटी, sorry, this is उसका बचपन. माँ मुझे गाली मत दो, तू मेरी माँ थोड़ी ही है, तू मेरी दुश्मन है, दुश्मन. तू मेरी लड़की थोड़ी है, तू मेरी सौत है. Now, this is something which is, where the context is of primarily of poverty. The daughter sees an enemy in her mother, to which the mother counters her by labeling her as salt, which is an object of sexual threat unconsciously, which is symbolic of object of envy and jealousy. Simone de Beauvoir writes that oldest girl, her father's favorite, is a special object of mother's persecution. So why we might not understand all this, because we might sort of, there's a tendency to idealize parents and kind of not deny them the agency of human subjectivity. So the narrative conscious reveals and signifies this particular unconscious fantasy. बहन लड़की जब बड़ी हो जाए और जब उसका कहीं ठिकाना न लगे तो वो सौत से भी बुरी है. अब मैं तुझसे कहती हूँ जवान लड़की का कायदा है कि घर में रहे, ना कि सारा दिन दूसरों के घर में ही करती रहे. तू अगर उसे जान से भी मार दे तो भी तुझे कोई कुछ नहीं कहेगा, वो तेरी अपनी. So we have heard about encounters of female infanticide, where the child, the daughter, is not a desired, sort of like a child. And this, I think I've already covered. So this is one set of fantasies which is originating. So just to kind of highlight, what we see is primarily it's around the mother. There's a fantasy of destruction, object of fear, and also hateful anxiety. Another set of fantasies which appears in the novel, another novel, is the nostalgia to learn and longing to fuse with the mother. और तब उसे पगली सी इच्छा होती है कि अपने कमरे में लौटने के बजाय यहीं सिमट जाए इन पैरों की. Like she's talking about the mother. इन बाहों को देखकर माँ की याद आ गई. कुछ दिन पहले उन्होंने बुलाया था. वह जब उनके कमरे में गई तो निगाह सबसे पहले उनके बाहों पर गई थी. कितनी बार छज्जे पर खेलते हुए वो यहाँ आती थी. खिड़की से माँ को देखा था. The mom who's bedridden and who's pregnant. अपनी चीजों के बीच गिरी हुई उथल-पुथल शाश्वत एक सफेद गुड़िया सी, एक छोटे से एहसास का बिंदु जिसे अपने भीतर दबाकर काया चारों तरफ फैलाती थी. So what we see is the nostalgia to kind of fuse and merge with the mother. And what do we fantasies we observe in Aapka Banti is heightened anxiety of separation from the mother. Every time Banti sees his mother going to college, leaving him behind, he seems to experience separation anxiety colored with psychic pain of sadness and fear of loss. For Banti, the boundary still remains merged with the mother, and perhaps that is why even little separation evokes an enormous anxiety, creation of mother's narcissistic world, which made him feel special and a part of mother's perfection. Separation is dealt with the fantasy of desperation, and this has been used by John Bowlby as a prototype of depressive tendencies. And also there's a mutual fantasy of fear, loss, and possession, which is shared by the mother and the son. अब ना तो कॉलेज है ना कॉलेज का काम. मम्मी फिर से उसकी हो गई है बिल्कुल उसकी. पापा से कह दिया है कि मैं यहाँ बिल्कुल नहीं रहूंगा, घर ही जाऊंगा मम्मी के पास, रात में मम्मी के बिना रह नहीं सकता. बेटा बंटी तू मेरे पास ही रहना. So largely what we see is definitely an unconscious, fantasy of the mother-son intimacy, and which Freud also recognized has been endowed with a set of prohibitions, set of censorship, which makes it a taboo. So incest fantasy is something which largely shapes the dominant imaginary, and these are set of masculine fantasies projected onto the feminine. And who is the prohibited object? The prohibited object is the mother. The prohibited object is the forbidden object is the mother. So what I want to kind of argue, so this is one of the most important idea that the imaginary of childhood, say in the Hindi literary imagination, entails a task of separation from the mother. So if you look at the fantasies, they are very destructive, they are very persecutory, mother being fearful, and this entails a separation from the mother. Maintaining a primary bond with the mother is not conducive for the child to have a relational identity. And this exclusive female parenting is what we see. It produces an ideology of male domination because the father remains absent and distant, and also male domination. And what exists is not that what Judith Butler says, that definitely this incest fantasy is heterosexual, but it's not the prohibition. What we get to see is the eroticization of the child. So this eroticization is again very, very explicit. It flows through the text, which says, सुन तो तूने देखा नहीं कि बहन जी उससे किस तरह लिपटी रहती है, तो क्या हुआ? आखिर उसका बेटा है। ये कौन सा तरीका है कि माँ इतने बड़े बेटे को गोद में लिए बैठी है? बड़ों मैं गलत कह रहा हूँ, कल मैं देख रहा था कि तुम किस कदर अभी भी उससे अभी भी तुमसे चिपका चिपका रहता है। ये सब बहुत नॉर्मल नहीं है। अपनी उम्र के बच्चों के साथ उसका बहुत जरूरी है। ये जो तुम माँ बेटों का चूमने चाटने और गले में बाहें डाल डाल कर लिपटने वाला जो रवैया है, वो अब बंद करना चाहिए। लगता है तुम अपनी इस अर्ज को भी बंदी के साथ ही पूरा करती हो। So this is a very clear indication of the gap. Another imaginary is that the mother emerges as a split object, which is what Christina calls as the object. So what we see is the normal conscious idealization of the mother. Like we have a tendency to really idolize the mother, being divine, nurturer. But in fact, what we see is the unconscious denigration of the mother. So why is mother denigrated? Because what I mentioned is to separate the child from the mother. Fusion with the mother is considered to be very threatening and repulsive. So there is a whole mythological institutional apparatus which is working unconsciously to create this separation, to deny the fusion. And this I have explored through what I call it as the maternal metaphors, which is very, very evident through fairy tale story, which are aberrant text, and what I have called it as the bewitched or the dematernalized object. And this split, what we see is a split. One end, we idolize the mother as a goddess, as someone who is so divine, but the unconscious representation expression actually reveals the position of the mother in the larger patriarchal society. Not only she has been domesticated, but there's an unconscious, attempt to ostracize, to really demonize the mother. And this I have done through mythical cultural imagination and the feminine body as the site of the object. What we see is a division. I mean, I've already talked about that. And the bewitched mother is actually a hideous, fearful mother. In the imaginary, the usage of the narratives and the stories which talks about lion, churel, witch, bhutni, demoness, Sautela, there is no Sautela father, suggest a depiction of negative and destructive potential of the mother in order to separate it from the child. So I know the time is also off, so maybe, I can just kind of, wrap it up here. These are some narratives. I can just say, माँ रात पीस रही है, उसकी आंखों में मानो किसी ने चमकती हुई चूड़ियां बांधियों से लगता है कि माँ कोई भूतनी है. So basically, I have also explored the body as a site where experiences of pregnancy, miscarriage, and menstruation creates a discourse of the feminine. Apparently, what Simone de Beauvoir says, there is no scientific reasonable discourse. Whatever discourse we have is in order to medicalize it, in order to create a domain of hygiene and reproduction, but nothing to understand the psychic impact of menstruation. And this is what I'm not going to delve into it now because of the time, but this is what I have called as the discourse of the daughter. To understand the mother's body as a site of knowledge, as a site of repressed knowledge. So this is, you can just have a look at it. This is the burdened body, and this is how I've explored. The maternal body stands as a metaphor for labor, which Gayatri Spivak realized that it's a site of exploitation and problematizes the male-centered definition of work. The labor and the maternal body as a laborous body remains unrepressed at the, whether there's a denial as an institution. And this is what I have done. So I would just like to, there's a lot, but I would like to end here. Because what is recognized is that separation works differently for sons and daughter. Sons get a lot of objective identification, because they have fathers to identify, there's a whole social realm to identify with. This has been denied to the daughter. So individuation, the imaginary for daughters is that of displacement. The daughters are directly displaced to another domain. So there is enforced separation and denied individuation to the daughters. And these fantasies are not just mere fantasies, they are actually institutionalized. Whether we see it in the fantasy of marriage as an institution where there's an exchange of women suggesting a homosocial unconscious. It's two group of men actually exchanging a woman to kind of legitimize their bond. So this is what she calls, it's a homosocial unconscious, which can, and this is a fantasy of displacement. Just to end, I think this is something that I really think is very important. The larger phenomena is of paternal absence. In the entire narrative structure, what we see is the invisibility of the father, and there's an eternal quest for the father, the visiting father who vanishes. And this is what I call the paradox of fatherhood, which is reflected that despite the continuous and pervasive absence, there is an idealization of the father. So there's an idealization of the father because the father is absent, because the father is perennially distant. And this missing link of intimacy, which is between the couple, and what I call it as the unintimate. So all the three couples, either they are abusive, distant, or conflicted. So the child is unable to recognize this link, and this is what psychoanalysts call it. For the child to separate, this recognition of the link is very, very important in order to individuate, because it will have different kind of manifestation. So this is about the father, and I think then I have explored that there is an absence of repressed father-daughter complex in the narrative. There is no awareness of it. And hence, I think this becomes a very political domain, and I've explored it through various concepts and critiques to understand various imaginations, whether it is to do with gender, whether it is to do with bisexuality, because that becomes a site of identification. So yeah, I would just like to end here. And my final conception is the perversion of the patriarch, which have done through exploring the father-daughter complex, and also the father and the son complex, which remains absent. And what I have done is try to invert. So I'm suggesting an inversion of the Oedipal triangle in Indian domain. So the child does not desire the parent, but also there are equal adult perverted fantasies for the child, whether we talk about abuse, whether you talk about homosexual expressions, because the father-son, the mother-daughter remains repressed. What is heightened, what is palpable in the narrative is the mother-son, which shows the entire project of demonizing the mother, and can understand it intuitively that this is where the position that the women occupies in the society. So yes, I think I'm not going to go further. I think this is this is it from my end. Thank you.
Any questions, comments, observations?
And there's still 10 minutes.
I have a question. Yes. Anybody else has? So, Nitya, what was the motivation behind selecting only these three particular novels? And we'll have to keep in mind that they belong to the 70s and the 80s era, not really far from 1947 effects. What was the reason for selecting only these three novels?
So I did a review. There's a chapter on the review where I reviewed all the Hindi texts and novels starting from 19th century till now. So what is one thing peculiar is that 1980s, there is not a single Hindi novel on childhood. So what we see is like a phase of decline, which again goes back because the dynamics have changed so much, whether it was the new liberal intervention, the whole, encounter with the digital reality that has heavily impacted. And that has not been yet captured through the literary expressions, because we are still, I think, doing a lot of research to understand this phenomenon. So 1980s for me was a limiting period. Like literally there are ones, but then they talk about womanhood. Like Krishna Sobhudi, I happened to meet her. She's a very, very, famous, literary personality in India. And that's what she also recognized. Now people are writing more on womanhood, about femininity, rather than exploring childhood. So this I problematize as because of the whole larger changing political, social dynamics, especially technological dynamics. You're right that the novel were around 1970. So why I chose that, what I said was how these texts problematize the social reality around. So whether it was about poverty, whether it was about, tapping the consciousness of a girl child, which I recognized in the literature has been largely missing. There is no discourse of the daughter. Like you read any, whether those are religious theology, Kakkar says that daughters are visible only through their absence, so they are foregrounded only through their absence, and there's no discourse. So I was looking for a literature which taps the consciousness, and third, like I said, is all about understanding the dynamics through in the times of so-called modernity, where the parenting relationships are changing. There is some agency, women has acquired some agency to speak for herself, to kind of nullify, negate the desire.
These criteria.
So I had these reasons to problematize the larger social reality where the text becomes an object of analysis. So literature as a text and language and the fantasies that they entail. And of course, 1947, before I just could not. I reviewed all of them. I do plan to now sort of work on them, not on childhood, but on womanhood. But like I said, the child was a very marginal object, who was only depicted as a victim, of the larger colonial reality, as sufferer. So whether you talk about Premchand, where he says the purpose of literature is to critique life.
Yeah.
And he writes Eidgah and so many other stories where you understand the plight of the child. You kind of sympathize that how the child exposes the oppressive reality of the imperialist regime. But there is not a speaking subject to express his subjectivity, and to express the consciousness. So these were the main three. And of course, Manu Bhandari being a female writer. So I wanted to understand childhood through a female, a woman's perspective, particularly. Yes.
I also have a question about the temporal nature of the selection, given that you're talking about the absent father. And involved father is a very recent phenomena in the Indian cultural context, right? And given that you are saying you reviewed the written Hindi text till present, right? And you couldn't find something that would fit, that would be eligible to be a part of your work, right? Is that then a function of the shift in focus of writing? Like you said, it's shifted from childhood to womanhood or something else? Or is it a function of language where not enough Hindi text is being written?
That is also true. Like I said, there's a decline. So Hindi literature was extremely fertile during the 60s and the 70s. Now with the changing dynamics, definitely. Now the literature, what most of it is being produced in English. So one can definitely tap the dynamics of language or the unconscious imaginary by turning to that. So for me, it was also because I wanted to tap the psyche of the Hindi-speaking people, which is the northern belt. So it's both the function of literary expressions, because literature depicts the consciousness of society, not just literature, even various art forms. Literature is a form of art. That how much consciousness the society has achieved, and this is what like Herbert Marcuse says, that this is the political function of the art, because it speaks and expresses, which the, individual cannot do. So why the writer write? This is the debate. Am I just writing for myself, or there is something to go beyond the mimetic representation, but to problematize? So writers have a social commitment to reality to effect a change. Like, what Sartre says, the literature raises a problem more than finalizing an answer. So and this is what in psychoanalysis has been happening. Like a lot of feminists are turning to literature. So instead of Oedipus, they're looking at Antigone. So what I'm saying is that a similar thing happening in India, so to speak, like, because I'm sort of embedded here. So for me also, I turn to literature for that, because childhood, I cannot capture the totality, the reality, and in such dynamics which might seem very unreal, that why would a mother be jealous of the daughter? But it can only come through that sensibility where we give absolute agency to the characters. To understand. If I interview, I think the project would have failed. It would have been extremely superficial. First, most of it is forgotten. Second, the repression is so active. Like in order, a lot of things would have been filtered. And of course, the whole, biasness that we are sort of endowed with, as a speaking. Yeah.
Question about you're talking about Hindi literature. It's basically the foundation is patriarchy. And this comes from a personal
Yes,
curiosity.
Absolutely.
That how would you place this, or if you have explored texts which also talk about matrilineal or matriarchal systems, where this
Not in the Hindi imaginary.
Of course, not in the Hindi. I mean, if you have.
That requires the resource of language.
I think that's what also I was thinking. For example, the text that comes to mind, one text which represents partially the focuses on the childhood that I have read, that comes to my mind, is God of Small Things, and how it's an English translation of a text written in a South Indian language from a community, or at least from a household that was matrilineal.
Yes.
Right. But that phenomena is not present within the non-Indian Hindi.
That would be very interesting. That would be very interesting to tap the dynamics and the fantasies, say, where the whole, the structures are different, the power structures are different. The repression works differently, but language is the key. That's what psychoanalyst says, that unconscious manifests through language, through the structures of language. Yes.
I think I was talking to you about this author called Amrita Narayan.
Yes.
So even she mentions about how pre-colonization, the psychic was different,
Yes.
and post. But she mentions about how it's kind of the same from 1947 to 85.
Right.
Because the women who were born after 85 born into products from outside.
Right.
Therefore, that influences their psyche. And she mentions about how there's a rise on striving to individualize themselves,
Yes.
focusing on sexual conflict. She also mentions about how women who grew up in the 90s have a strong conflict of mourning and aggressiveness. And she also talks about how therefore there's a lot of movement on rape, right for rape and against,
Yes.
and basically on separation from the family.
Yeah.
So I think the books maybe from after, since the 90s would tell
a different story.
of the mother-daughter.
But this also sort of like, because what we assume the whole product of modernity, emancipation has not permeated throughout India. A large population of India does remain very poor. A lot, the girl child, female infanticide, girl child's marriage, which is very, very prevalent. So there is going back to Taylor, what we see is the phenomena of social practice and its how it's legitimized. Yes. So, and it creates a kind of a moral order. So we cannot talk about psyche as something which is very interior, disconnected with the reality. These institutions also entail an unconscious fantasy, in terms of desire, in terms of course, desire is what Lacan speaks of. Freud never talked about it. So the desire being projected to the mother being the first object of desire, right? Again, the language of it. So definitely after 90s, I agree with you, there will be a complete different sort of a stuff. But because I have problematized based on a prevalence of a phenomena, and what you said, the continuity of literary sensibility from 1947, this also has been recognized by, Vasudha Dalmia, where he says in Hindi literature, the sensibilities have not changed so much. So the Hindi speaking mind has perhaps not experienced the emancipations through, say, socially, politically, economically. Marathi literature, I feel, it would reveal a very different kind of society.
It has been a very different kind of a psyche even before
Even
1947.
through institutions, I feel. So this is the intimate connection between literature, institutions, and say the intimacy.
In Bengal, if you study Sharachandra Chattopadhyay, Vibhushan Bandyopadhyay, so they are like Martin Pachali. They are very supporter of thinking about the women's and.
Yeah. The woman is a speaking subject.
I don't know about what is happening in Hindi belt or Hindi literature, but especially in Bengals and some kind of Assamese, I study about that. It's to fully support and they are what I say advocating such thing.
Absolutely. I mean, Bengali literature would be. I don't know Bengali. I wish I would.
You should study Sharachandra Chattopadhyay and Vibhushan. They are very feminist one.
Yes. Very.
I think it would be untrue to say that you don't have such stories in Hindi literature. There are, but I think given her study, she was focusing on childhood, as she said. So you have Shivani.
Also mentioning Mandu.
That's Urdu. That's not Hindi. Urdu literature is very.
Language is the key here.
Yeah.
She's focusing on Hindi because of the nuances that she wants to focus on in Hindi.
Yeah.
You know, words like Diane and Chudel and so on. Yeah, there are not equivalent words to that in English itself.
English like Helen Keller also.
Similarly,
Helen Keller also.
I think people are very interested. That's great. But we'll take up only last two questions. If there are any questions.
If symbolic does not allow you to see visibly the imaginary, that's where the need of psychoanalysts or somebody like you have to come in to show what is not visible. Now, the sources of normativity or imagination, if at all there is some changes, given your claim that the national discourse 1947 and after that have changed the imaginations or imaginary of discourse about childhood, I'm little suspicious to accept that claim because even when Freud studies in a classic particular sort of thing, these are not just a discourse altered by nationality. They are very probably the source of normativity goes even back to the religion or even probably the texts that are written before these literature. So to claim that something has changed after 1940 in the imagination of childhood, can you?
I can. So I want to clarify, I'm not saying that the imagination of childhood has changed. What I'm saying is the literary expression. So the child as a literary device, as a literary tool, occupy a different position in the nationalist discourse. And there's a shift where the child has been employed in larger, full complexity as a speaking consciousness, where the child is a full character. So there's not a change in the, you're right, in the discourse on childhood, but there's a narrative, there's a change in the usage of the child as a narrative device in the literary expression. That also emerges from the various social movements. So in Hindi, there was a whole movement called the Kahani movement, where writers were writing very differently. Manu Bhandari, Nirmal Verma, all these are part of. So they were trained in the West. They had knowledge about. So that was very different movement in the Hindi literature. So again, and secondly, going back to the religion, I think of course I have reviewed what Kakkar basically is the one who produced that the child again doesn't occupy an agency. It's either to divinize the child, whether it's Ramayana, the Ram and the Bal Gopal and Ganesh, and it's There's a lot of divinity, there's a lot of idealization, personified idealization, but at the same time, the child does not appear as an agency, it appears more as a wish fulfillment of the parent, or the embedded in a lot of rituals around childhood, which depict certain things about the psyche, and it's very grammatical. Again, there is no narration narrative on the girl child. It's all about the son, who are deposited with all the idealizations. So the girl's voice remains repressed. And, and I have sort of created a whole theory of melancholia, which is based on these institutional practice. So it's just not a clinical condition, but rather it is also a very institutional effect, how daughters are positioned in, and how can that feminists are countering that. And for that, we need to use the structure in order to disrupt the structure of parenting and of design.
If that is the case, to probably, because you have a lot of evidences, in what ways that the imaginations and the mythologies is different from this literature? Can you give
There's
one or
not,
two?
it's corroborating everything. The mother appears to be like there's a whole discourse. I mean, there is a whole section on demonization, the maternal metaphors, which are all mythified. So the mother's body, there's no discourse on women's body. It has been demystified, as so like, let's say the metaphor of, I mean, if I can just go back to the slide, there is this. Yeah. So the myths are discussed, what is called, it has been investigated, I mean, primarily invested with the whole idea of mother. So the mother is what occupies, the myths are around the mother. Okay, I mean, you won't find many myths around the father. And mothers are personified in a negative light, primarily as a witch. So what is the function? So mothers have been imagined in a very devouring, someone who can devour their own children, who is a threat, which kind of evokes an uncanny sense of fear, but not just a fear. It demands an entire project of repulsion and separation from the society, from the patriarchal society. So the woman just not occupies, she is outside what you just said, the symbolic. She represents the real. And this is what I'm trying to do. Real is what is repressed. And real, I mean, for Laka is something which can even not be symbolized by language. It is something which flows, which overflows, even out of the language, which is primarily the affect. So feminists like Christiva, they look at poetry as a form of a literary form in order to, and that's how she conceptualized the notion of semiotics and fora. That is the affect overflowing to text. So the real actually defines what is it, is what is repressed, what is traumatic, what repeats itself, but also what is evidently institutionalized. So it's just not a mere fantasy, sort of wishful thinking, but there is a whole apparatus working as an institution.
Thank you so much, Nitya, for your time, and it was definitely really interesting. And if you have more questions, you want to talk about it, it's a never-ending discussion, which we just started off today. Especially students, if you're interested in this area, you want to work in this area, you can always contact Professor Nitya. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.